Now, I've got to be very careful because I've been watching you and your reactions over the last few hours. So I don't want to give you a repetition of what I've said, but some of it is going to be unavoidable, I'm afraid. But this is much more pivoted on, and I never have, in the House of Commons or otherwise, operate from written texts. I never have done, and I never intend to do so. Whether that's a good or a bad thing, you can judge for yourself. But I much prefer a spontaneous way of putting across an argument. And as I've said earlier, although sometimes the moderator had difficulty in restraining me, it's really just enthusiasm, that's all. I've been involved in this question for a very long time, and I believe very strongly that it does not work for the nation states. That's really the problem. There are aspects of this where I believe that general cooperation is good, but and I think the idea of alliances is good. But in general, despite the resistance by the Euro-Federalists, and I beg leave to differ with Tony about the extent to which the Euro-Federalist project is alive and kicking, it certainly is within the institutions, whatever the realities are, those who committed themselves to Euro-federalism may regard this as a temporary reverse, but I don't really think that in what they would regard as a great sweep of history, that this is, from them, a stoppable operation. For them, it is a continuing project. They genuinely believe that one country in Europe is a good idea, and I genuinely believe it is not. And I think that the contrast is moving in the direction in all the member states of those of us who, as I said earlier, were in a minority, and I think we were at that stage. I don't have any doubt about it. I don't think we are now. And one of the aspects that didn't come up in the previous discussions was the fact that when referendums have taken place, which is an illustration of an attitude of mind, and a vote is taken, on every occasion the referendum decision has been shelved and has been then repeated, and more money has been pumped into the yes vote on a staggering scale. There was a young participant here from Ireland. Where is she? She's gone. No, she's at the back there, from Ireland. Oh, anyway. But, I've taken a very active part in the referendum campaigns. I worked with Séguin and de Villiers on the Maastricht referendum in relation to France. I set up a thing called the Maastricht referendum campaign in the United Kingdom, and we got something of the order of 700,000 signatures to a petition, which I presented to Parliament. That was in, I think, 1992 or 1993, which was in very early days. But even then people were reacting really quite strongly in the UK. But when they had the Irish referendum, or indeed the French referendum, when they've denied referendums in other countries, and then they reversed them, pumping in vast sums of money, and in the case of the Irish, where, again, I've been on the stump campaigning in these countries, the French referendum was actually on the platform with Séguin and de Villiers, doing my best to strangle the French language. But we had a really very, very good response. And the no vote a few years ago in France was really quite overwhelming. But did that stop them? And the same in Holland. The short answer is nothing stops the Federalist project. And it's really, as I said, the triumph of hope and over experience. So I believe that the movement amongst people towards having a different system, I call it an association of nation states, not quite sure what formulation it would really take, but it would be to give back to the people who the people have elected the right to be able to make the decisions about the kind of laws that they should be governed by. And we didn't mention majority voting in our previous discussion, but you have to remember that majority voting means that in the belief that there is some God-given right and a treaty right which has been conferred by governments, by the way, whipped votes, not asking people about it, but actually by arrangements that are made between the leaderships of the various countries, they devised a system of majority voting which meant that in what they perceived to be the interests of the people of Europe, right, the laws which are made will be imposed upon individual countries by decisions that are taken or not taken, because a lot of it is not by vote, it's by consensus, because they avoid a vote if they think there is a likelihood of defeat. And the net result is that in the individual parliaments, they then go ahead on what I regard as a completely constitutionally unacceptable way to pass laws as if they were made by the individual parliaments, when those people who are in those parliaments have actually been elected by the people in the street, if you like, but actually they're passing the laws that have already been passed in the Council of Ministers by majority vote. Not necessarily respecting the national interest, but only respecting that which the people who are in Coreper, that is the ambassadors from the European Union, plus the civil servants in the countries concerned, plus the leaders in the individual countries concerned, in this great European elite, if I can put it in general terms, believe it's in the interests of Europe as compared to the interests of the individual countries. Now, of course, when I started to argue against all this back in the late 1980s, Margaret Thatcher was the Prime Minister. And I remember actually writing something which must have been regarded as complete heresy when I said, even when she was Prime Minister, that what was being done was appeasement or acquiescence. And that, of course, didn't make me incredibly popular at the time, but that didn't matter, because actually I don't take my position as one which is based on popularity, but on what I feel is necessary to be said. And the judgment at that time was that, we were wrong, but actually, as things developed, and very quickly I take you through to take the ERM for an example, which we said would not work, and of course Britain was ejected, and there was a lot of toing and froing, Tietmeyer and Schlesinger and all that argument that went on. I could give you a history talk about that, but I won't. The fact is that Norman Lamont, who is generally regarded as a Eurosceptic, and John Major, who said he was a Eurosceptic, were all promoting a system. Nigel Lawson and Ken Clarke and John Major. Remember that Nigel Lawson was Chancellor of the Exchequer, John Major was the Foreign Secretary at the time, and they forced Margaret Thatcher into the ERM against her better judgment. And they both threatened to resign, which would have been very difficult for any Prime Minister to have the Foreign Secretary and the I think it was actually Geoffrey Howe and Nigel Lawson, as a matter of fact, with John Major to follow. So we had a sequence of people who were completely dedicated to the idea that all this was going to be marvellous and was going to work, and there was a small minority of us, and I genuinely concede that at that time that was true, who were saying this is not going to work, and we don't believe, and we cannot get into the euro. And although a lot of people have claimed that they were the ones who kept us out of the euro, it was the Maastricht Rebellion that kept us out of the euro, and everybody knows that in reality. And the bottom line on all this is that we set out a vision to go back to our main theme, does it work for nation states, that the way it was being devised was not in the national interests of the UK, and subsequent events, if I may put it very simply, I think have demonstrated that certainly as far as the euro is concerned, that we were right. We were certainly right over the exchange rate mechanism, and just to strike fear and terror into the hearts and minds of future historians, I have actually kept a diary since 1988, every single day, much of which pivots on the European issue, and it'll be for others to judge in due course what happened as compared to what people were told was happening. Because obviously during the whole of this period I was having meetings regularly with the various members of the cabinet. I wasn't privy to all the secrets that were going on, but that is all part of a future history lesson. But as I said, the referendums are what people have thought, and they've been overturned. And I believe we've got two crises, one of which is economic, and the other is democratic/political. And the old vision of the United States of Europe is still embedded in the system and the acquis communautaire and the legal framework and the European Court and the institutions, etc. But actually the people have changed their view, and I think that the problem is that the institutions won't recognise this, and there is no new thinking. Now, I put my case very, very sketchily on the idea of an association of nation states. But I really do believe that we need to have a new conference, like the Larkin conference, which preceded the Lisbon Treaty. At that time, we remember, some of you will be sort of engaged because some of you are postgraduates, so it's not that many years ago, we're talking about 4 years ago, there hadn't been a crisis in Europe, really. We had the Cold War and all that, but there hadn't been an economic crisis. It's only, and we were saying there will be one, and we think that there is one, but people are not recognising it, because actually there isn't the growth and all the arguments about over-regulation which I've already put, and which I've been putting for 20 years. But it's very easy to be right by hindsight. The question is, are you actually right? And if that is the case, then the case for review is now compelling. And I believe that we need to set up a new convention of Europe, and if they could do it for the Larkin deal, which led to the Lisbon, or actually it led to the Constitutional Treaty, which then got abandoned because we won the argument, if I may say so, over the Constitution as it was. But then they came along with the Lisbon Treaty, which was again supposed to work for the nation states, but Giscard and the others simply said, and it's all on the record, so I'm not telling you anything which I'm inventing, they said, of course, there isn't any real difference between this and the Constitutional Treaty. So they don't listen. So although they were defeated on referendums, they were defeated on what I would regard as reasonable objective analysis, they still just carry on. I'd like to ask a question.
Yeah, widely argued that the referendum, especially in Ireland, was lost over national issues, and not really. I mean, they also said people were really well informed and they were really dissatisfied with the current governments and with the general political situation and economic situation, and that their vote didn't just express their opinion about the constitutional treaty. And I mean, I know the Lisbon Treaty is like, it was like it's a constitutional treaty minus symbolic language, but I mean, I don't know whether these referenda which were really lost about Europe. So.
Well, they were, and I'll tell you why. Because everybody received the information, but it wasn't properly discussed. I accept that. But the reason that it wasn't properly discussed was because they were sending out propaganda messages the whole time and pumping vast sums of money into the PR spin. This is the problem that you get with modern society. And of course, you have the state, all the newspapers in Ireland were in favour of yes, for newspaper reasons. All the people in the government were in favour. All the leadership of all the parties were yes. And the radio and the television were all for yes. And yet the people said no. And it was not just about one or two issues. You could mention the abortion question, for example. People are not that stupid. And actually, the arguments were understood by the man in the street, and they just simply did say no by quite a significant margin. And I think that what you're relaying is the mythology that's been created by the spin merchants who want to try to demonstrate that it wasn't actually a proper referendum. I agree with you that there is sometimes a reflection of national politics. But in this case, you have all the leaders of all the parties all saying yes.
But maybe it was too late for this propaganda.
Well, you can argue that if you like. Well, we'll leave this on the table. But I can tell you, I mean, I was there, and I was also in France, and I was, involved in the British campaign for a referendum. And all I can tell you is that people are very vociferous about these questions, and they're not actually taken for fools. And certainly today, given the crisis that exists, I don't think that the fact that people are now feeling the pain of failures of policy, that if there were referendums now, that they would get anything but the same answer, which would be no, and that would reflect the genuine arguments that are going on at the moment within the framework of the European economic crisis that exists. So I think that the problem, as I said earlier, about the economic crisis and the bailouts and the necessity for these countries to actually get real about whether or not they can just carry on being subsidised by others, and for what purpose? I mean, why would it be necessary? And I take the point that the Spanish participant put about the difficulty that existed under the Franco period, and you have a similar situation in Portugal as well, and that there were internal reasons in the early period of accession why they wanted to get away from that kind of repressive society. And I understand that, just as I understand why it is necessary, or was necessary, for people to move away from the past regarding German domination over most of Europe, and followed by Russian domination over a large part of Central and Eastern Europe. All this is perfectly understandable. That is why people embraced the idea of a European Union. And those of you who have actually read the speeches that were made, for example, by Chancellor Kohl and all the other leading participants in the development of the United States of Europe arguments, in a way, all make sense when you read them in the context of that time. But whether they were actually going to work or not is another issue. And I come back, therefore, to the fundamental question, which is that it doesn't work if it doesn't satisfy the popular views of the man and woman in the street. It doesn't work if it's based on propaganda rather than on analysis. And if there is no safety valve where the representatives in the individual parliaments are effectively being used as puppets to deliver policies which are decided by majority vote, then that is only a reflection of the decisions that are taken by the elite without regard to asking the people themselves whether or not they want those policies or not. And give you an example. I gave the Lisbon agenda. They had to admit didn't work. The and I mean, it's not just me saying that. The European Commission said it. They come up with a 2020 strategy, which I don't think has any greater chance of success either. You have the Schengen arrangement, which is already under intense pressure because of the realities of life. What I'm arguing for is a kind of realpolitik, which is that people should really recognise what is really going on in the economy, what is really going on in terms of immigration, what is really going on in terms of small businesses, and what is really going on in terms of lack of growth. And it will be impossible to change that simply by writing another treaty or by going down the route of the kind of policies that are represented by the Lisbon Treaty itself. The Lisbon Treaty had a fairly rocky ride, but following on from the Constitution. But as I said before, certainly in British terms, the whole of the Conservative Party, David Cameron, William Hague, the whole lot of them, all trooped through the lobbies, voting against every aspect of the Lisbon Treaty. But because it had been signed up to by, at the moment, it was June the 25th, I think it was, Margaret Beckett came to my committee. She was the Foreign Secretary at the time. She said that she was out of the loop on the question of the decision that was being taken. The decision was taken between the 18th and the 25th of June, and that was the time when Gordon Brown took over from Tony Blair. And I believe very strongly that there's a connection between the takeover between Brown and Blair and the fact that the treaty was signed by Gordon Brown. You may even remember he turned up late and all that sort of thing. The fact is, it was just literally a political manoeuvre at the time with very serious consequences. And David Cameron was completely against it. So were the rest of the Conservative shadow cabinet. And yet, despite the fact that that was the case, and we voted against it consistently in the House of Commons, when he took over as leader, we then ended up by accepting the ratification, and the so-called cast iron guarantee that we would have a referendum on it was abandoned. So you can see that there are those of us who are really quite worried about the manner in which these things are put through. In addition to which, I mentioned the competitiveness problem and the difficulty of competing internationally. And I've also mentioned the fact that in terms of the economic consequences, we also have a lack of safety valves in the individual member states. And there's a very interesting paper written by Ronald Valbel from Mannheim University. I don't know whether any of you have come across it, and it's called Regulatory Collusion. And I won't go into the detail except to say that what he argues is that the majority voting system is very well manipulated by those who understand how to do so in a way that produces results for certain countries at the expense of others. But it's well worth you studying that as postgraduates, because it's a very interesting and I think an important analysis of the way in which majority voting actually works in practice. But I come back again to the fact that that is despite the effect that it has on people. Then you have the problem of riots and protests, which are going on all over the whole of Europe. I don't need to go into detail about that, you know that. And in addition to that, you've got the rise of the far right. Now, in 1993, I wrote an essay in a book called Visions of Europe, where a lot of Eurosceptics got together and we all wrote different essays. They weren't very long, they were about sort of 4 or 5 pages each, saying why we thought that the way it was all going was not a good idea. And in there, I said that I thought what was really going to happen was that the economic system which was being imposed on everybody would eventually fail, and that if that did happen, the consequence would be that we would get massive unemployment, and on the back of the massive unemployment, you get an increase in the far right. Now, that is happening. I mean, you know, I'm not trying to say I was a prophet. I'm just saying that we had the evidence, and we put the 2 and 2 together and came up with 4. And it was that there would be massive unemployment, protests and riots. You can't stop riots and protests except by taking extreme measures, or by solving the problem by getting to the root of what the riots and protests are about. And that's what they're not doing. It's just more Europe, not less. So just at the time when we're on the crest of protest, riots and economic dislocation, and we'd scarcely discussed the European Financial Stability Mechanism, which itself provided a pot. That was the first of the bailout mechanisms, which, by the way, Madame Lagarde actually said on the 17th of December last year violated all the rules. I mean, I'm not inventing this. I can actually produce the press report and the detail of it. She actually said we've broken all the rules. Why? She said because we want to maintain Europe. But they actually claim that Europe is a rule of law, but they break the rules when it suits them, irrespective of the consequences. So the first of the bailout mechanisms, which is called the European Financial Stability Mechanism, and what was that based on? It was based on what's called Article 122, which is to do with providing money in times of natural disaster. Floods, things like that. And they used it for the sake of a financial crisis which had been induced by the failure of the system itself. So the whole thing, as I've said repeatedly in the House of Commons, was illegal and remains so. And yet the Portuguese bailout, and this is causing a lot of trouble, I raised it with David Cameron in Prime Minister's Questions only yesterday, we are being expected to pay in times of austerity. This is the man in the street. It's not me speaking. I'm just telling you what I'm hearing and watching and listening to the man in the street. He can't get his hospitals. He can't get proper health care. They've got people dying in significant numbers in old people's homes. I mean, you know the history of it because it applies in all the different countries. And yet, we are expected, though we're outside the Eurozone, to pay £8 billion out of this pot that we agreed to on the basis of an illegal use of the treaty. And there's no argument about it. I won't go into all the detail, but I mean, nobody seriously believes that Article 122 is a legitimate basis for the payout of this money. And yet the people who are affected by it are saying, why should we pay £8 billion to Portugal when in fact we're outside the Eurozone? And even if I was in the Eurozone, I would ask the question, is it such a good idea? Now, some people argue that the reason for it all is because you want stability in Europe. But what if, instead of creating stability, you create more instability? If all you've done is to buy off by another wave of printing of money and or by a retransfer of debt, and by restructuring, not by restructuring, but by bailout, instead of facing countries with the necessity of realizing that they can't have something for nothing, you actually end up by putting off the evil day when you have even more trouble later. That's the problem. This is a kind of Alice in Wonderland fantasy world that has been created. And I'm not saying that because I want it. I'd love everybody to be able to have the kind of economy that exists here in Germany. And the reason it's here and not elsewhere, and by the way, I'm not going to exonerate the German government either, because, and I hope the camera's running, it probably isn't, but I'm telling you, they broke the bailout rules, and so did the French. And back in 1953, there was a massive collapse of one country, which resulted in bailout. What I'm saying is that breaking the rules, as Madame Lagarde admitted, in relation to this mechanism, is not the best way to substantiate a system which itself is supposed to be based on the rule of law. It's very much, to put it bluntly, you obey the law as long as it suits you. And by the way, it doesn't suit the people, it suits the institutions, it suits those who have this continuous and nirvana belief that somehow or other it's all going to be okay at the end of the day. Actually, it's not, because competitiveness in the global economy is real and absolute. You can't compete with the wage levels in China and India and the rest of it simply by pretending that somehow or other, it doesn't exist. In the real world, that is what people are having to deal with, and the Americans are realizing that as well. So we have, as a consequence of this, a movement away from the rule of law. And there is another problem, which is in relation to defence and foreign policy. I mean, to be quite frank, they've set up this massive external action service, which is in itself a really serious invasion of the diplomatic services of the individual countries at huge expense. And so far, one can only say it's a joke. And Madam Ashton, or whatever she calls herself, Baroness Ashton, is not representative of the national interests of the individual countries concerned, and I think the Libyan episode has merely demonstrated that. But this is not this is only a recent example. What they did was to go ahead with the idea of a common foreign security policy and a defence policy, and the addition to St Malo and all the rest of it, irrespective of the fact that every time anyone ever witnessed anything happening in the Middle East or wherever else, it didn't work. And yet they go on doing it even when it's palpably obvious that it doesn't work. And the situation, as I said, with Germany for its own national reasons, abstaining on Libya, despite the United Nations resolution, the rest of it, and we had the episode over Iraq before. The fact is, they say one thing and they do another. So then there is also the other question, which is the one which I'll now move on to before I sit down, because there's so much I could say, but much of which I've already said. That is what I call the German question. I don't think it is possible or responsible to discuss the future of Europe without considering the place of Germany within the framework. Because certainly, as I said earlier, in the 1940s, in the immediate post-war period, many people quite rightly believed that this must never happen again, and equally that it was necessary to ensure that we created stability in Europe as a whole. As I've said, I don't think that the way in which the stability mechanisms are operating will achieve stability, but this is another and much more serious question. And it's this, that Germany, and there are all kinds of papers that I've no doubt you've read about whether or not Germany is, there's a paper here, Germany in the European Union, is it moving from tamed power to normalised power? Seems to me there's an awful lot of patronising waffle that goes on in a lot of these papers that are written by these academics. What does the earth does that mean? From tamed power to normalised power. And they conclude it's now normalised power. This is the kind of thing that they have these, excuse my saying this, Tony, but the Foreign Office meetings at Wilton, and along come these people, I won't even mention their names, and they give talks about this transfer from tamed power to normalised power. Look, the bottom line is that Germany has got its act together, and it's got its unit labour costs down, some of which, and this is where it gets a little bit less comfortable, I believe through having significant investments in poorer parts of Europe, such as the Czech Republic, Poland and other countries, where you get a differential advantage and then you repatriate the profits that you make from those lower wage rate areas to your advantage. It's called the law of comparative advantage. Now, am I going to complain about that when I consider how Britain actually created its own industrial force in the 19th century? I'm not. But what I am saying is we need to be realistic, and that actually a lot of these other countries have been given transfers in terms of infrastructure. Spain in particular has got per capita such a vast disproportionate amount of money more than other countries in relation to its head of population, because Chancellor Kohl did a deal with González just as González was going out of power. And the bottom line is that was a piece of realpolitik by Germany to get the Spanish on side. And it was reflected, ironically, in a rather strange way, symbolically, when there was the Normandy landings were being, it was the 50th anniversary of the Normandy landings, and I remember it very vividly for obvious reasons, my father being killed in the war, but also because I had a discussion with Edward Heath at the time. And as it happened, all the Allies went to Normandy, and Chancellor Kohl went to Dresden with Gonzales. It's quite symbolic. So the bottom line is that the manner in which the redistribution has taken place has been done without any tangible benefits, except in terms of infrastructure, to the countries concerned. Because you can't generate growth, to come back to our Spanish friends' discussion and argument about capitalism. You can't create capitalism just simply by generating ideas. It has to come from the creation of small businesses, entrepreneurs who start small and grow bigger, or some just stay small. And certainly in Britain, and I dare say in most of the rest of Europe, about 85 to 90% of all businesses are small and medium-sized businesses, which is why I say at these meetings that I attend in Europe, you must get this right. You've got to deregulate to give them the oxygen to enable them to do so. And by the way, a lot of the infrastructure projects, which are represented by European regional funds and the rest of it, actually, again, are transfers of money, but superficially it looks as if it's Europe, which is not true, because it's actually coming from the taxpayer in the first place. Secondly, those countries that get the contracts then get the money back into their own country. So people want to be wise to this and not to be taken into the idea that this is some kind of great charitable enterprise which is actually being done out of the milk of human kindness. So let's get real about that too. But if you create massively good roads, and in Ireland you've got them in Spain, you've got them all over the place, okay? But they don't actually have vibrant small businesses. It's just another kind of rather attractive and probably for the time being an understandable white elephant. But it will remain a white elephant if the enterprises are not in the individual towns and cities which will generate the growth that's needed in order to pay for the public sector, which is needed for the healthcare, for the ageing population, and for the education and one thing and another. What I'm really saying to you is that there is an element of a con trick about all this, all for the purpose of advocating a policy which certainly I could understand in the 1940s and 1950s because of the experience of the war, but time moves on. Now it's become counterproductive with a policy which is positively undemocratic, which is unconnected with the man in the street, which doesn't work, and which is creating financial crises or is accelerated by the failures of the system. And, for example, the European Central Bank. Very interesting story today, which you may not have picked up on yet, I don't know, and that is that Sarkozy apparently has managed to get his man as president of the European Central Bank. All the betting, and I have to say that all these bits of paper I've got here is a sort of resume of the development of the European Union over the last 6 months. And everywhere, in The Economist, Wall Street Journal, you look back, and as I was coming over on the plane, I was reading about how Weber is bound to get it because Merkel's behind him and nobody's going to do anything to upset that apple cart, are they? Well, by the sound of it, it looks as if this Italian, Drogo, whatever he calls himself, is going to be made chairman of the bank over the dead body of Angela Merkel, politically speaking. And so that actually may turn out to be a very serious difficulty because the manner in which the ECB has operated in line with what I would describe as Deutsche Bank principles may now be on the line. And the one thing I wouldn't have laid any bets on, however distinguished Mr. Drogo or whatever he calls himself is that he will pursue the kind of rigorous policies that are required in terms of the German paymaster. So if you have a bank which is operating, already they've started buying up junk bonds and junk assets, And there's I'm not an economist, our friend over there who is, and maybe others of you, may understand some of this better than I do. But my reading of it, and I can only go on the analysis of the most intelligent papers that I can get my hands on, is that actually buying up bad assets is what happened with Lehman's, etc., etc., and the consequences are very severe. And in Ireland, forget it. I mean, the situation in the Irish economy is catastrophic. And the situation in Greece is catastrophic. And the situation in Portugal is catastrophic. And Spain may turn out to be much the same. And this is not just light talk. This is about, because we're all in this together. So if we want to be engaged in trying to improve the situation, we want to start listening to what people say. If the German people themselves, and I pay credit to them for the fact that they've achieved an enormous economic miracle, if they can do it, why can't others? And there's no reason. And I said I'd give you the figures on the trade balances. Well, I won't actually, because they're extremely complicated and the print is so small I can't read it with my glasses. But if you look at them, and I recommend that you do, and you study them very carefully, look at what's called FDI, foreign direct investment. Look at outward investment. Look at trade balances. Look at the question of who manages to get the best slice of the cake. And you will see that there is one country which just smashes everybody into smithereens, and it's Germany. And if one country can do it, then others should be doing it as well. But of course, Germany has acquired a kind of stranglehold, if you like, over the other countries' economies by their direct investment policies, and that's put them into a predominant position. I haven't used the word domination, but it's getting very close to it. And that is all part of the problem. And that is recognised by the serious politicians and the serious ministers of the individual nation states. So we want good working relations, but, for example, the manner in which some of the decisions have been taken recently on the European Stability Mechanism, which was much driven by German requirements, which are themselves, I don't think, are going to come into effect until 2013. And the whole question, I mean, Angela Merkel did not want the bailouts. Actually, I can see a very good reason for not having them. But other people prevailed, but that hasn't created a very good atmosphere in the German population, because the German people are saying, well, why should we bail out these countries when we have to work out our own salvation, and we've done it pretty well. So I do think there is, to use, and I'll conclude on this note, a very important question which remains unanswered, but which I've indicated I think is moving in the wrong direction, and that is, and I've said this in the House of Commons, so I'm not saying something to you I haven't said there, because I'm always very upfront, and I always tell my constituents what I really believe. If they don't like it, they can reject me, but my majority has quadrupled in the last 20 years, so perhaps that's some indication of the fact that someone's been listening out there, including switching votes to support what they believe in themselves. But I'll finish on this note, which is to quote Thomas Mann, where he asked the question in those days, and that's some time ago, will it be a European Germany or a German Europe? And I think we're moving more and more towards the inevitability of a German Europe. And I've said in other contexts to German audiences that I don't think that is in the interests of Germany, and I don't think it's in the interests of the individual countries, and I don't think it's the interests of Europe. But I pay credit to the German people for the fact that they've managed to not only resurrect their economy, but actually to turn it into an economic miracle. But the other countries are just simply not doing well enough, and there is no excuse. Thank you very much.